Podcasting challenged the conventional form of how we consume content. Why do they have security and a front desk keeping you out from communications? And they're like, I don't know why. Because it's very valuable. It's very expensive. Without podcasts, we would not have counter information for the last few years when everything started getting censored across the board. Imagine choosing how you want to consume this, and the AI will make it to the version that you like. So I have a feeling we're going into the age of literally like infinite choices on top of infinite choices.
Hey, Chris, welcome to the show.
Steve, thanks for having me on.
So the thing about you, and I want to jump into it very, very quickly, you're quite a engineering kind of mind. You like to decipher things. You've been involved in crypto before it was trendy, podcasts, events. In fact, I read something about you even in the Guinness World of Records for holding like one of the biggest events, and then you broke it again by doing it again the following year. So you're the kind of guy, and we're going to go into your book, that likes to look into things that are up and coming and how they can control. But one of the biggest things that I personally know you from is the world of podcasting and the biggest event, Podfest. So here's my first question. If anyone doesn't have a podcast out there, have they missed the boat?
I don't necessarily recommend everybody to have a podcast, but I do recommend them, if they have a book, to think about going on a podcast to tour. So I think people should be aware of podcasting and the power of it. And 10 years ago, when I don't know how many years, it's longer than 10 years ago I started in this space, but I remember people that were keen to it had books and they were selling thousands of copies by going on podcasts. And most people didn't know what the word meant yet. So sometimes you just got to pay attention to what's going on. Now, podcast, RFK Jr. Was on Joe Rogan, and he said, I think I could win the nomination by just going on podcasts. So it just goes to show you how full circle we've come, that candidates now look at podcasting as not only more legitimate than what you would call the mainstream, but that's really where the audience is. People are listening or watching on podcasts.
I've always been a great fan of podcasts, and we had a little conversation at the beginning of this. You know, I don't charge for my podcasts. I don't sell space for people to be on it. I don't sell sponsorship. I make no money from podcasts. I get the chance to be able to have conversation with interested people, provide a platform, provide an avenue for you to distribute your message. And I love podcasts, and you picked up on the legitimacy of it. I do believe that having a podcast, even though it's unfact-checked, it's two dudes, guys, girls, whatever, having conversations, there's a certain legitimacy, a certain authenticity to it versus having an article in, say, I don't know, Forbes, which is what, you know, everyone wanted to go for. And let's be honest, if you had the chance today to have an article in Forbes or to go on Joe Rogan, you know,
that's a no-brainer. That's a no-brainer.
Exactly. So why do we love podcasts so much?
Well, two things happened about a decade ago. So I'll give you a little history of how I see things. So YouTube took off straight out of the gate. On-demand video was huge. And you'd say, well, didn't podcasting take off with it? It did not. Podcasting did not take off with on-demand video. The reason is we were still tethered to our radio in our cars. So for us to really take off to audio listening, you have to really go back in the Wayback Machine. People only listened to audio for the most part while they were in their cars because the radio would pick up. So I realized really quickly that there was about an 8-year lag behind adoption of podcasting behind YouTube. YouTube was already a very big star maker by the time podcast even started crawling. Now it's dominant, but back then it was not. And the reason is you have to have a phone that's Bluetooth enabled. And I know now we take it for granted, but back then there were so many different cell phones before the iPhone became the dominant brand. And you also needed to have a car that allows you to sync your Bluetooth. Well, you switch your phone every couple of years, right? So that's not bad. But most people don't switch their cars for 8 years. So between those two technologies to sync up, it allowed us for this opportunity of this golden age of audio to show up. In podcasting, Steve, you know this because you've done a lot of training. Podcasting challenged the conventional form of how we consume content. So if you look at the late night shows, right? I didn't even know, most of us didn't know we were conditioned to watch some celebrity show up, some funny, stupid story, Then they do a happy little dance, and then the show is over. You've probably watched 20 commercials in the meantime. You're buying the book. A podcast allowed someone like Steve Sims to get on a podcast, and for 2 hours. I mean, I listened to you on Ryan Pineda's show talking about how much you love old fashions, and I laughed my butt off when you talked about some place in California that you had booked. See, I remember this. How it shows you how sticky podcasting is. You booked a venue, and when you asked the bartender to make you an old fashioned, I mean, their version was not your version, and you canceled the engagement. So, I mean, think about that. As small a fact as that is, that stuck in my little head forever because it was such a funny story. Because I know you as a personality, and then you're just sharing like, the guy couldn't make an old fashioned. I love events, right? So you're like, I'm not doing an event there. I remember that from a podcast you did with someone that you probably, you're just sharing whatever. I still remember that to this day. So it just goes to show you how sticky it is. So when I think of you, I think of an old fashioned, and I think of your love and reverence for the classic old fashioned. So I guess that's an example of like how sticky these things are. I don't know if you could go long form and talk about an old fashioned for 5 or 6 minutes on these stage scripted shows. So I think podcasts allowed us to discover different formats, different concepts, and people responded. I mean, Joe Rogan does 3-hour interviews. If you and I, even both of us, were betting like 15 years ago, I'd probably be like, there's no way no one's listening to 3 hours. You know what I mean? We'd be like, maybe an hour, but 3 hours?
Yeah.
So it's long form is the whole definition has changed, but this is how audio started. I mean, this is how radio started. Radio, look at the audio dramas of War of the World. All these things happen, but when radio got commercialized and the government got involved, everything changed. Now, with podcasting, it's unregulated, so everybody has a voice, like you said. It might be scary, but it's also great because we get diverse opinions, diverse people on all these different shows.
Hey, I'm sorry for interrupting this podcast. I know it's a brilliant one, but I wanted to talk to you about your room, your connections. Now, we know full well that great things come from great connections and great rooms. Now, if you're in a room full of people that will challenge you, inspire you, motivate you, and support you, then great. But if not, then maybe I have the solution for you. Head on over to stevedsims.com, look up Sims Distillery there, and join our community of creative disruptors, those that are only not there to help you and motivate and actually give you information, but to support and answer questions. We very much vet the room to make sure that we support each other's growth. We all want each other to grow. So if you want to be in the right room, head on over to stevedsims.com/Sims Distillery, and I'll see you inside my room. Enjoy the rest of the show.
Well, also, if we look at the radio has, every artist has 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, the length of that song, So if you look at a morning radio show, if you look at a morning TV show, if you look at the celebrity late night show, every celebrity, if you really are top of the game, then maybe you've got 10, maybe 12 minutes.
That's where you get 2 segments, right? You get 2 segments. That's the only way you get that.
If you're really good. But if you get on a podcast, you're the show.
Right.
You get 30, 40, or in the form of Joe, 3 hours. So I can see the benefit of podcasts, but why are still people a little bit, we want to talk about Podfest, we want to talk about your book, but should people be nervous about starting their own podcast?
I think nervous is a good thing. I think podcasting allows you to put your voice out there. This is what I would say. So you're exceptionally gifted at bringing people together and making people feel comfortable. That's a skill you bring. I like when people start within a niche because we know that there's an audience probably waiting for that information to be delivered. And once you're comfortable within that niche, you could explore outside that niche and see if you could grab an audience. Obviously, I'm a big proponent for podcasting. My wife is a full-time podcaster. She does meditation. She's the largest meditation podcaster in the world for women. So she just hit 100 million downloads, but we didn't start that way. And you know what? Don't worry about that number. She is an aberration and she is an exceptional person, but we've been doing it for such a long time. It's all about kind of what value do you think you could provide to an audience? podcasting is probably one of the greatest ways for you to I think people, here's what I think it is, Steve. I think we're tired of third parties translating what's going on. We want to hear from the horse's mouth. And it's a famous US saying, I don't want the media to tell me who RFK Jr. is, or I want to hear RFK Jr. on Joe Rogan for 3 hours. And if you look at what Joe does, when he has exceptional talent like RFK, he just lets them talk. And as long as it's interesting, he doesn't butt in. The only time he butts in is like to get to the next interesting point.
So you developed, you saw this, you recognized it early, very early on, and you actually came up with the concept, you're going to do a major event on this new medium. Yeah, this new media of podcasting. How scary was it for you to do that when still it was, how long ago was it when you did your first Podfest?
I mean, we did the first meetup. It was just a meetup, right? It started with like a little meeting 2013 in August. And then Podfest, we did 2 big workshops in 2014. Then the first Podfest was 2015. We're about to hit our 10-year anniversary. We had 100 people at the first one. Remember, podcasting wasn't big back then, so it's like you get 100 people is a lot.
And that's what I'm saying. You were jumping into it at a time and telling people, hey, forget the mainstream media. You need to own your media, which is a key thing here. Podcasting, you own your conversation, you own your narrative, you own your own tonality, you own your own inconsistencies and imperfections. But you recognize that very early on, and you're talking to people about this major event of this major medium that people are still looking at going, well, that's a novelty, because at the time, and of course, Joe Rogan's changed it with video and so many other people have, but at the time it was audio only.
Correct.
So did you get any kind of kickback or flack on that?
No, but we listen, I'd have to explain to people what a podcast is. And then we got so tired of explaining the term, we would just say it's online radio. This is in the early years. Now people know the term, but that was half my education was like, and then I remember I had one audience in Sarasota. They skewed older, and they were like, how much? The first question is like, what is it? Online radio. And then they would say, how much? And I would say, it's free. And they'd look at me stunned, right? And they say, where is it? I go, it's on every one of your phones. And older people tend to have iPhones because they're easier. I have an iPhone, but I'm just saying, like, if you have 100 people, like 97% of them have iPhones. So it's very easy for me to say, you see that icon? That's where you access. And Steve, I swear to you, after I told them where it was, because they didn't know what they were doing, they were hitting buttons. All of a sudden, I had 90 people playing different podcasts, and I'd have to go around and turn off the podcast at every single seat so I could keep talking and teaching. But anyways, it was a fun. I love the fun of it. And you might ask, like, what kept me going? It wasn't the money, because there was no money in it when there's like 100 people. Like, what are you going to make? And we didn't charge crazy ticket prices. It was the freedom. Before this, and you've done a lot of media interviews, and I always say to people, what's the first thing, if you've done a lot of TV interviews or the big radio stations, what's the first thing you encounter? And if anyone's smart, they say the front desk. I go, how do you get in? They go, usually there's security, or they buzz you in. I go, right. Why do they have security and a front desk keeping you out from communications? And they're like, I don't know why. Because it's very valuable. It's very expensive. They control the gateway. I go, when else can I go to my home, my office? You and I are talking, and now we're going to put it out directly. So for me, the concept, like you said, it was a revolutionary concept. So that's what kept me going. And that's what I really, without podcasts, we would not have counter information for the last few years when everything started getting censored across the board. So and the reason is, Steve, is they can't shut down your RSS feed because you own it. It was created so the individual owns it. So it's the only form of media that is not controlled, even though they almost, you could always almost get to it, but they couldn't control podcasts.
So we don't want to wait until the end. How do people find out about Podfest? Let's throw this in now.
Yeah, just podfestexpo.com. We're going to be celebrating our 10-year anniversary, January 25th to 28th. Now, we're a little bit bigger than the 100 that we started out with. So anywhere between 1,500 and 2,000 creators. So this is a creator con. So if you're someone that's already actively creating, you could either learn how to podcast, or you're doing podcasting, or you're podcast adjacent. This is where you would go to meet and learn from other amazing creatives. We usually have about 100, 200 speakers. Everybody shares their best practices, and the community we built is very giving and very sharing.
Now, it's not expensive to set up a podcast. So, run us through some of the basics. If someone's out there and they're like, well, hey, I'm into knitting, I'm into goats, I'm into cooking. What's the basics they need to set up a podcast?
Honestly, a microphone. I see you're using StreamYard. That's a great streaming tool. Squadcast. Some people use Zoom, which is fine. That works too. It's not StreamYard's a little bit better. That's what you're using right now. So Squadcast. those are like very small monthly fees. And then the microphone will cost you maybe, my microphone's $100. My wife, who does meditations because she wants it's right, and it's a Audio Technica. It's right behind me. Sorry, right somewhere there. But my wife's is a Shure SM7B, which is like $350. But after that, that's basically, as long as you have a laptop, you kind of have what you need. If you don't want to get involved in editing, go online, find an editor. Podcast editor community on Facebook is a great group, and then let them do the work, and then you just publish your episodes.
All right, so good. So people shouldn't be scared. I think mine's a Shure 58, and I think mine I got for like $80.
Yeah.
And I can beat someone to death with it and record a podcast at the same time. The thing's indestructible. So, all right, so podcasts. We know that they give access to a person. So like you said about my old-fashioned story, if someone gets to relate to the host, and they tend to stay with them through all of their guests. So you end up building up a relationship. I'm stunned at how many people, we got Brandon Turner, there's so many different people, Kasim Aslam out there, Perry Belcher, Roland Frazier. Everyone's got these podcasts, and they get listened to by millions of people that they actually become celebrities in their own world, having conversations from the office at the back of their house, which is, usually a converted bedroom or something. So it's a great way to actually get into that conversation. But where do you see podcasting going? Do you see any regulation? Do you see any boredom? Do you see the areas? We've seen it gone into video, but what do you see as the expert for podcasts happening?
So you mentioned video. We saw that trend in 2016, 2017. We're going to see a lot more video podcasts. YouTube, believe it or not, even though it's not technically a pure podcaster, would not, the purist, let's just say the old guard, would not consider YouTube a podcast because you don't own your RSS. Meaning, you can do a podcast on YouTube, but they could shut you down at any moment. So you always want to own your RSS. But I do see a lot of people getting on video. I see video being a huge growth curve. I see Twitter adding video, which is going to be that's going to be the biggest game changer, because I think Twitter might become a third competitor inside the world of audio and video podcasting. We've already seen some leaked emails that it's in play behind the scenes. So that's going to change a lot of things. Remains to be seen, but more than likely it should change quite a few things. So I would recommend, if you can't do a video, having some kind of video component is going to help you in the future. And then the metaverse, I know a lot of people kind of got burnt out because a lot of the, crypto went down in price, but Apple still has those glasses coming out. People are going to be consuming things. And let's say, Steve, maybe they just want to watch you interview, or maybe there's a AI program that you take the audio now, creates 10 different versions of Steve talking to me in 10 different versions, and the person picks their experience. You're going to see a lot more. So the way you and I lived through, so when I was a kid, there was only 3 or 4, maybe 10 TV stations, and then cable came out, and then that went to 29. That's what's going to happen with podcasts. So right now it seems like we have infinite choices, but we're going to have infinite choices of the infinite choices. So this show itself will have infinite choices, but we're not there yet. It's going to take years, but imagine choosing how you want to consume this, and the AI will make it to the version that you like. So I have a feeling we're going into the age of literally like infinite choices on top of infinite choices. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. We always think that we're saturated until we find out what saturation's like. And as you say, it's like having the TV where you had, I remember, I'm older than you, having four controls in England, and all of a sudden you got 12 stations, and then all of a sudden DirecTV comes out and you got 4 million crap ones. So, there's always this infinite on infinite. The podcast itself, for anyone out there, and I'm going to hit 2 questions from 2 different sides of the fence. For the person that's looking to do the podcast, there's usually, and I think it was like 22. Someone said that like the average podcast lasts for 22 episodes and then they get bored. Is that true? Am I wrong? Did I hear that wrong? But what is the average depth of a podcast?
I'll give you like a bigger stat. There's like 1.4 million podcasts listed on the Apple Store, and only like 290,000 are active, meaning they published in the last 90 days. So the majority of podcasts don't last. So what that means is people like you that are consistent, they just keep building their audience. So consistency and being in the marketplace is a huge is a huge value proposition. So the answer is yes, most people will start and stop. But I think part of it is that they just didn't, maybe they didn't have an audience. A lot of people just do it as a hobby, but other people have an audience in mind. Like you're doing this for an audience. So you're showing up, you're putting the show. Some people don't have an audience in mind. They're just doing it because they just want to, put something out there, and they usually stop.
Yeah, I remember when I reached out to you and you said something about how were your downloads or something like that, and I went, "Oh, I don't know. I just have
your numbers were
conversations
great."
every week." Yeah, but that was because of consistency. Obviously there'd been no marketing, there'd been no dollars had spent behind it, so that was good there. Now, let's flip onto the other side of the fence. In my office, I'm called the podcaster. And I remember speaking to Jordan Harbinger years ago from the Art Charm, one of the old OGs of podcasting. And I was starting to get into this thing called podcasting. And I said to him, how do I pick the right shows to be on? And I remember he sent me like a 4-page document on how to filter through downloads, ask these questions, audience level, all these kind of things. And I sent him back an email with an attached PDF going, well, here's my parameters of being on a podcast. 1, they have to have a podcast. 2, they have to be alive at the time of recording my podcast. And those are my only 2 parameters. And of course, I went on to anything. And I went on to Jordan's, Tim Ferriss. I went on to some of the largest podcasts out there. And they didn't really move the needle. And then I went on to like someone that owned a small, warehouse company in Iowa or something like that. And all of a sudden I could see the following day, I'd have a ton of followers on Instagram and think it's a lot more instantaneous. And I realized then that the smaller niche podcasts had a tighter connection and community feel. Do you feel that?
So, Mike Michalowicz, author of Profit First. Yep. I cornered him one time because I saw he was doing a lot of podcasts, and I'm like you, I want to know market research. I said to him, who sold the most books for you? I like right straight up, He goes, what do you mean? I go, I know you're like on 100 podcasts. Which ones move the needle? He goes, you would never know him. I go, try me. So he's like the guy. I had one guy that talks to limo drivers. He only had 200 people, but they sold like 30, 40 books. So you're 100% spot on. The people with these niche audiences where they're the trusted expert for that profession. If you get really sharp and focusing on like those kind of shows and you go on 100 of them, you'll outsell more books on those shows, because on the bigger shows now, they've become like the ubiquitous cable shows. You're watching them passively. You're there for the host. Not bad. It's still good for your credibility. But if you're looking to like move something, my wife, before she did meditation, had a show called Biz Women Rock. She had like 700 or 800 people listen to her show. But when she said to her audience, I'm going to this conference, outside of a Podfest for sure, but other conferences, she'd sell like 20 tickets. And we would metric other people. They couldn't sell more than 1 or 2 tickets. So I couldn't agree with you more. Your instincts are 100% spot on. If you could find those people that are servicing the niches, even they could have 50 or 100 people. Those people are loyal to that person. Move some major bookage. Now, the challenge is, Steve, there's some people that just started a show, and I don't know if you've ever been on one. I have, where I have to take over halfway through and start asking them questions. So you're there to serve those people and help them through it, and I think that's great. But I like Jordan, but Jordan gets so technical about things. It's kind of funny, but that's what makes him so great. It's his full-time profession, so I respect that.
And you're right, as a podcast guest, and this is just a PSA for anyone out there being a podcast guest, sometimes let's rephrase that. Your job is to deliver an amazing show, even if the host can't keep up with you.
Couldn't agree with you more.
There has been situations where the guys ask me a question, and it's just a shit question. I've gone, well, look, I can answer that question, but there was a similar one that was asked to me. Shall I jump into that one? And they've gone, yeah. And I've jumped down that rabbit hole. So your job is to actually bring the heat, bring everything. But the thing I love about podcasts is because there's so many, most of them actually stop because they can't get guests.
Right.
So they're always looking to be fed. If you're going to be picky and go, well, look, I'm not going to do a podcast until Joe contacts me, then what's the point? You're missing out on all of that momentum. And again, when you've got a podcast which is listened to by 50, 200, 100 people, When they listen to the show, they then go, oh, my buddy Chris, he was speaking to Steve. And they share it. And you can literally see the following day from it land, your socials just suddenly peppering up and, getting tagged and things. So I'm a great advocate and believer in podcasts are fantastic. But now let's flip over to the book, Using Podcasts as a Platform. And we're going to pick on you because you've got a book. What's the book called? Where can they get it?
So the book is called Start Ugly, and they could get it on Amazon. It's a fictional story about someone that had to learn the lesson of having to start ugly, because I think many of us procrastinate or we wait for the perfect moment, and there's no such thing in life.
So why?
Well, if you think about what I do, I deal with creatives all across the world at PodFest, and I have heard people, I need the perfect mic. I need the perfect voice. I need the perfect setup. And I got tired of answering, like, just get started. I was at a seminar. This is even before podcasting with some business people, and I was using a Sony camera. This is before our cell phones had cameras. I used to have thousands of videos on Vidler, YouTube, all these sites. People forget, but there was like 9 sites when YouTube came out where we all would aggregate everything. But anyways, so I remember they're all saying, I'm going to get that Sony. I go, the Sony is not what's creating the work. It's me. The Sony is a tool. So I said, just start. In frustration, Steve, I just yelled out, just start ugly. I basically want to curse, but I said, start ugly. And I remember one guy raised his hand. He's like, can you tell me more about that start ugly? I was like, okay, that's sticky. And then I figured out a story. It takes place in the early 1900s. It's fictional. I made it up about it's about a lumberjack that swings an axe and has an entire lumber mill, and they're doing research and development for lighter, sharper axes. And every 6th day they give the lumberjacks training and a day off and all this. And some kid that he hired in his R&D was heading home on his bicycle on Manhattan Island. This is on Manhattan Island. And back then in the early 1900s is when they put telephones in. And he snagged his bicycle on the telephone pole. And the kid got an idea of, like, what if I take a bike chain and rotate? I think it could eat wood faster than an axe. So basically, it shows you that no matter how good you are, if you're not paying attention to innovation, the chainsaw will beat the axe any day of the week. So the owner didn't understand the innovation, fired the kid in the R&D lab. The kid creates the first chainsaw, and the owner almost goes bankrupt. And there's a story of redemption in there. But the best compliment I ever got, you'll appreciate this, Steve. I had my brother read one of the early copies, and he said to me, I don't know where you ripped this off on the internet, but you cannot publish it. And I said, I wrote it. He thought I ripped off a story off the internet. He thought it was a factual story off the internet. I go, no, I wrote this. He goes, listen, he goes, you're going to get in trouble. Don't rip off other people's stories and put your name on it. I go, no, I really wrote this. He couldn't believe that I wrote the book. So to me, I was like, okay, I'm onto something. I wrote something good. My brother thinks I ripped it off from someone on the internet, which I would never do, but it was just a funny reaction to have, a sibling to have to something you created.
So you've got this book out. You're hoping it's going to get people to challenge the perfection. I've always said that, perfection is a blue unicorn with 3 testicles. It doesn't exist. And too many people are scared because they constantly go, I'm going to do this. Now let me plan. And of course, no one ever plans for a downfall. You're actually going, hey, get out there. And Ari Meisel's got a great saying. He says, get going and then get good.
Right.
So you're bringing this book out now to get people to challenge the way they do things in order to just do things. You can always improve, but let's get going. Let's learn off of that experience. How is that going to be tying in with the events that you put on and the 10-year anniversary?
Well, so you hit my catchphrase almost in different words, but I always say it's start ugly and perfectly execute along the way. It's not start ugly and stay ugly. So it ties in perfectly any event I do, because everybody's starting something, they're learning something. So we'll have it on the tables. People take pictures with it. The best compliment I ever got was a gentleman had a child that had some delays developmentally. I think the kid was 11 or 12 years old. He read my book and started a landscaping business after I read the book, and created flyers, went door to door. And the guy called me. So I've been very fortunate that we've sold quite a few of these copies. But the key with the Start Ugly is the people calling me and telling me stories of how it impacted someone in their family. Or I actually designed the cover. So I know it's good for me having in the background when I do podcasts, but I put it there for myself. So when I get lazy, I turn around and look at it and I'm like, all right, let me just get started, and I move forward. So you don't have to even read the book; just have the cover around, and the cover will spur you to action.
And are you using podcasts as your major focus to get the book out there?
Yeah, I almost exclusively. Now I do events. So obviously, the events help a lot, right? So I sell a lot of books at my different events. But if I'm ever on a podcast, it's usually to promote either the book. Podfest is pretty well known, so like I love promoting it. But honestly,
well, it is now because you made it well known. You were there at the
100%.
beginning. And you've stuck with
yeah,
it.
the inertia
So,
and the momentum took off. But the book is what I could promote. Where I could, if you say like, Chris, what's a piece of you that goes out? Podfest people always say, why do people talk about Podfest as if it's their own? It's because, like you said, it took 6-7 years to tell the audience this is yours, not mine, and let's promote it. So I've been very fortunate that creators we have big announcements for the 10-year Podfest, but we're gonna have some of the largest podcasters in the world honored at Podfest. So we have some huge things that I'll be announcing in the next couple months.
Well, and I don't want to take those, and I'm not going to ask you to do that. But where is Podfest, and where is it going? And what date is it going to be?
January 25th to 28th in Orlando, Florida, at the Wyndham International. If you just look up Podfest Expo, our website will pop up. We're the trademark holders to the name Podfest. So if you see anything named Podfest, let me know so we could remind them that they can't use it. But it's become ubiquitous with podcast festivals. Yeah, so listen, it's been a wild ride. I mean, I started with 13 people at a meetup. Now we're hosting close to 2,000 people all across the world. I have to write, people don't know, but certain countries, you have to write embassy letters for them to come in to study. But it's not unusual for me to have the right hand of like a prime minister of Ghana or some like countries you're not thinking of, like, hey, well, I need to come in and I heard about Podfest, or people in the Middle East. So it's a melting pot. It's a great place. Everybody has a good time. We all help one another out. The majority of people are from the US, and then we get a lot from Europe. Since it's in Orlando, they fly right over. So it's a great time.
I'll be honest with you. I know you. We've met at events many times. I've never been to Podfest. I will more than likely be at Podfest for next year because I want the education. You know, this is something that I've been having fun with. I'm not going to say I'm going to take it seriously, but I want to be aware of what else I can do to it. So I'm very proud that you actually put that on. And your book, Start Ugly, they can grab that on Amazon, or is there a website?
Amazon is the best place. And if you like it, leave me a review. If you don't, call me directly.
Chris, I want to say a massive thanks for doing what you're doing, giving people a platform where they can be themselves, educating people to realize that they own it. You said about it quite simply. This is a platform, an RSS that you own. You're not susceptible to Twitter suddenly taking a piss on you and just dumping you off, or LinkedIn or anyone else.
Any of them, yeah.
You own your content. So, Chris, thank you very, very much. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it.
Cheers, pal. Well, that was another episode of the Art of Making Things Happen podcast with me, your host, Steve Sims. If you like it, you know the scoop. Subscribe, tell your friends, share it around. Let them get benefit from this juice. And of course, if you want to change the room you're in, join Sims Distillery. Jump over to stevesims.com/Sims Distillery, or you can find a link directly from that website. That's the room where creative disruptors get together to actually help each other become better. If you've got standards or you want higher standards, join the right room. See you next time.